The Vietnam War. From 1955 to 1975, the Vietnam War became one of the most harrowing conflicts for soldiers, especially those fighting in the dense jungles of Southeast Asia. For American, South Vietnamese, and Allied troops, as well as the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong guerrillas, it was a war defined not only by combat, but by disease, psychological trauma, and an unforgiving environment. The jungles of Vietnam were a nightmare battlefield. Soldiers marched through sweltering humidity, plagued by mosquitoes carrying malaria, leeches clinging to their skin, and constant infections from minor cuts and wounds. Heavy monsoon rains left men drenched and miserable, while oppressive heat and dehydration drained their strength. Many troops recall the jungle itself feeling like an enemy. Every step was uncertain, every rustle a possible ambush. Combat was relentless and unpredictable. Unlike conventional wars with clear front lines, Vietnam was a guerrilla war. Viet Cong fighters used the terrain to their advantage, setting traps, planting punji stake pits, and launching surprise ambushes before vanishing into the jungle. Soldiers lived with constant fear of unseen enemies, whether in rice paddies, villages, or dense forests. Helicopter assaults and search and destroy missions often ended in confusion and heavy casualties. Chemical warfare added another layer of misery. The widespread use of Agent Orange and other defoliants stripped jungles bare but poisoned soldiers and civilians alike. Decades later, veterans still suffer from cancers, birth defects in their children, and chronic illnesses linked to exposure. Napalm strikes turned the landscape into a blazing inferno, leaving unforgettable scars, both physical and psychological. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers lived with constant tension, not knowing if a farmer was a civilian or an enemy fighter. Night patrols, booby traps, and the loss of comrades created deep trauma. What came to be known as post-traumatic stress disorder haunted many veterans long after the war. By the war's end, more than 58,000 American soldiers and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese troops had been killed. Survivors carried not only wounds, but memories of a war where the environment, the enemy, and even their own governments seemed to conspire against them. For soldiers, Vietnam was not just a battlefield, it was a relentless living hell. The Soviet-Afghan War. From 1979 to 1989, the Soviet Union fought a grinding war in Afghanistan that became its own version of Vietnam. For Soviet soldiers, the conflict was a decade of brutal guerrilla combat, unforgiving terrain, and growing disillusionment that left deep scars on those who survived. The war began when Soviet troops invaded Afghanistan to support a struggling communist government against local insurgents, known collectively as the Mujahideen. What the Soviets thought would be a quick intervention turned into a protracted guerrilla war against fighters who knew the mountains, valleys, and villages intimately. Soviet soldiers, many of them young conscripts, quickly discovered that the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. The terrain itself was a nightmare. Afghanistan's jagged mountains, scorching deserts, and freezing winters made every operation punishing. Helicopters became lifelines for transport and attack, but Mujahideen armed with US-supplied Stinger missiles soon turned them into deadly targets. Soldiers on the ground endured ambushes, landmines, and hit-and-run assaults that made progress almost impossible. Convoys were shredded by roadside bombs, and villages turned into traps. Life in the field was harsh. Soldiers lived in primitive outposts with limited food and water, often surviving on bread and tea while dealing with disease, heat stroke, and frostbite. Morale collapsed as the war dragged on. Many conscripts were poorly trained, ill-equipped, and forced into service with little choice. Letters home revealed feelings of isolation and betrayal, with soldiers questioning why they were dying in a distant land for unclear goals. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers witnessed the destruction of villages, civilian casualties, and comrades killed in sudden ambushes. Drug use became widespread among troops seeking escape from the daily terror. By the war's end, about 15,000 Soviet soldiers were dead, and tens of thousands more wounded or traumatized. When the Soviets finally withdrew in 1989, the soldiers returned to a homeland unwilling to acknowledge their sacrifice. Many veterans felt forgotten, left to cope with broken bodies and haunted minds. For those who fought, Afghanistan was not a noble mission, but a relentless war of attrition, in which survival itself was a hollow victory. The Iran-Iraq War. From 1980 to 1988, the Iran-Iraq War became one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century. For soldiers on both sides, it was a war of attrition that combined modern weapons with medieval levels of suffering. Few conflicts illustrate more vividly what it meant to be a soldier trapped in a nightmare of political ambition, endless battles, and inhumane tactics. The war began when Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, hoping to exploit the chaos following the Iranian Revolution. What he expected to be a quick victory turned into 8 years of grinding combat along a 600-mile front. For the soldiers, this meant endless assaults, trench warfare, and battles over the same ruined landscapes again and again. Conditions on the ground were appalling. Both armies relied heavily on young, poorly trained conscripts, some barely teenagers. Iranian forces, inspired by revolutionary zeal, often launched human wave attacks against entrenched Iraqi positions. Soldiers advanced across minefields and barbed wire under heavy artillery and machine gun fire, suffering horrific casualties. For many, survival was a matter of chance rather than courage. Adding to the horror, both sides used chemical weapons, most infamously Iraq's deployment of mustard gas and nerve agents. Soldiers without protective gear suffocated, burned, or died in agony from invisible poisons. Survivors often carried permanent lung damage, blindness, and disfiguring burns. International treaties against chemical warfare seemed meaningless on these battlefields. Disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion were constant companions. Trench lines flooded in rain, creating pits of mud and filth. Medical care was overwhelmed, and amputations or untreated wounds left soldiers crippled. Even when not fighting, soldiers endured shelling, air raids, and the terror of sudden chemical attacks. By the time the war ended in 1988, an estimated 500,000 soldiers had died, with millions more wounded or traumatized. Neither side achieved a decisive victory, and the borders remained largely unchanged. For the men who fought, it was a war defined not by honor or gain, but by years of relentless suffering, proof that political pride can consume an entire generation of soldiers. The American Revolutionary War. From 1775 to 1783, the American Revolutionary War was fought for ideals of liberty and independence. But for the common soldier, it was an ordeal marked by hunger, disease, and brutal conditions. The conflict, waged between the American colonies and the British Empire, became one of the hardest wars to survive, especially for poorly supplied continental troops. The hardships began with supply shortages. American soldiers often lacked proper uniforms, shoes, and even food. During the winter at Valley Forge in 1777, thousands endured freezing temperatures with little more than rags to cover their feet, leaving bloody tracks in the snow. Disease swept through the camp, killing nearly 2,000 men before spring. Hunger was constant, and soldiers sometimes boiled leather or foraged desperately for scraps just to survive. Combat was equally punishing. Muskets and cannons caused horrific wounds, and medical care was primitive at best. Amputation was the most common treatment for battlefield injuries, often without anesthesia. Infection claimed more lives than musket balls. Soldiers fought in brutal conditions, from scorching summers in the Carolinas to freezing winters in the Northeast. Guerrilla raids and ambushes added to the strain, as men never felt secure, even in supposed strongholds. Prisoners fared even worse. American captives held by the British on prison ships in New York Harbor died by the thousands from starvation, disease, and neglect. Conditions were so atrocious that survival was unlikely. More men perished in prison than in battle. The psychological toll was heavy. Many soldiers went unpaid, their families at home starving while they fought. Loyalty was tested constantly, with desertion common. Yet despite the misery, the Continental Army held together, driven by the promise of freedom and the leadership of figures like George Washington. For the rank-and-file soldier, the Revolutionary War was less about lofty ideals and more about enduring hunger, disease, and endless marching. Victory brought independence for a nation, but for those who fought, the cost was measured in scars, graves, and suffering that would last a lifetime. The Russian Civil War. From 1917 to 1923, the Russian Civil War tore through the former Russian Empire, plunging soldiers into one of the most chaotic and unforgiving conflicts of the modern era. What began as a power struggle following the Bolshevik Revolution quickly spiraled into a multi-sided war involving Reds, Bolsheviks, Whites, anti-Bolshevik forces, anarchists, nationalists, and foreign armies. For the men fighting, survival was less about ideology and more about enduring famine, brutality, and endless violence. The conditions were horrific from the start. Soldiers often lacked uniforms, boots, or weapons. Many conscripts were peasants forced into service at gunpoint, sent into battle with little training and sometimes without rifles of their own. Hunger was constant. Entire units scavenged or starved as the countryside, already ravaged by World War I, collapsed under the strain of civil war. Disease swept through camps, with typhus alone killing millions. The fighting itself was merciless. Both the Red and White armies committed atrocities, executing prisoners and terrorizing civilians. Battles raged across vast stretches of land, from frozen Siberia to the ruined cities of European Russia. Soldiers endured long marches through snow and mud, often for campaigns that led only to more slaughter. With shifting front lines and countless factions, no one could ever feel secure. Psychological strain was immense. Soldiers were caught between brutal commanders and hostile populations. Desertion was widespread, and reprisals for those caught were severe. Many men switched sides repeatedly, fighting for survival rather than cause. For prisoners, captivity often meant torture or execution, as mercy was in short supply. By the end of the war in 1923, an estimated 7 to 12 million people were dead, many of them soldiers. Hunger, disease, and exhaustion killed more than bullets or bayonets. For those who survived, the Russian Civil War was less a battle for ideology than a descent into chaos, where every day meant new hunger, new terror, and the possibility of death at the hands of friend or foe alike. The War of the Roses. From 1455 to 1487, England was consumed by the Wars of the Roses, a brutal dynastic struggle between the houses of Lancaster and York for control of the crown. While nobles schemed and kings rose and fell, the ordinary soldier bore the brunt of a conflict marked by betrayal, starvation, and the savage brutality of late medieval warfare. Unlike the long, set-piece battles of later centuries, the Wars of the Roses were unpredictable. Armies clashed in sudden, bloody encounters where thousands could be cut down in a single day. At Towton in 1461, the largest and bloodiest battle of the war, as many as 30,000 men were killed in a snowstorm that turned fields red and rivers into choking streams of corpses. Soldiers wielded longbows, poleaxes, and swords in close-quarter carnage that left the wounded screaming in heaps on frozen ground. For common troops, conditions were grim even outside the battlefield. Many were pressed into service by local lords, with little training and minimal armor. Food was scarce, and men often scavenged or looted villages to survive. Disease and exhaustion killed many before they ever reached battle. Captured soldiers had little hope of mercy. Nobles might be ransomed, but ordinary men were butchered or left to rot. The shifting loyalties of nobles made the war especially cruel. A soldier might fight under one banner only to see his lord defect mid-battle, leaving him surrounded and slaughtered. Families were torn apart as allegiances shifted from York to Lancaster and back again. By the time Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at Bosworth in 1487, bringing the conflict to an end, England was scarred by 3 decades of intermittent war. For the men who fought, the Wars of the Roses were not tales of chivalry and honor, but a grim struggle for survival in a land where kings treated soldiers as expendable pawns. The French and Indian War, 7 Years' War, from 1754 to 1763, the French and Indian War, part of the wider global 7 Years' War, turned North America into a battlefield of mud, disease, and relentless violence. For soldiers, whether British redcoats, French regulars, colonial militias, or native allies, this conflict was brutal in ways that went far beyond musket fire. The terrain itself was punishing. Much of the fighting took place in dense forests, swamps, and rugged frontiers where supply lines constantly broke down. Soldiers marched for weeks through wilderness with little food, gnawed by hunger and plagued by disease. Dysentery, smallpox, and fever swept through camps and claimed more lives than battle. Many men froze in harsh winters or drowned during dangerous river crossings before ever facing the enemy. Combat was unlike the open field clashes of Europe. Soldiers in brightly colored uniforms suddenly found themselves ambushed in forests by French troops and native warriors who excelled at guerrilla tactics. At battles like Fort Duquesne, entire British columns were annihilated in minutes, cut down from cover while trapped in confusion. The infamous massacre after Braddock's defeat in 1755 left a deep impression on survivors, many of whom described it as sheer slaughter rather than battle. Sieges were equally grim. At places like Fort William Henry, defenders endured bombardment, starvation, and eventual massacres once the walls fell. Prisoners often faced horrific treatment, as atrocities committed by both European and native forces became part of the war's legacy. The war dragged on for nearly a decade, and for soldiers it meant endless marches, hunger, disease, and death in a hostile wilderness. While Britain ultimately triumphed, seizing vast territories from France, the men who fought rarely saw glory. Instead, they carried home scars, missing limbs, and memories of comrades buried in the forests of North America. Reminders that for the ordinary soldier, the 7 Years' War was a war of misery as much as muskets. The Yugoslav Wars, from 1991 to 2001, the breakup of Yugoslavia unleashed a series of conflicts that became some of the bloodiest and most chaotic wars in modern Europe. For soldiers, these wars were marked not only by brutal combat, but also by the moral and psychological strain of fighting in ethnic civil wars, where neighbor turned against neighbor and atrocities became part of daily life. The fighting was fragmented and unpredictable. Soldiers were often drawn from militias, hastily armed with whatever weapons they could find, and thrown into battles that ranged from open field clashes to block-by-block urban combat. Cities such as Vukovar, Sarajevo, and Mostar became killing grounds where snipers, artillery, and siege tactics turned civilian neighborhoods into battlefields. For soldiers under siege, food, water, and medical supplies were scarce, and survival depended on both endurance and luck. Conditions were harsh across every front. Harsh Balkan winters left soldiers freezing in trenches or half-collapsed buildings. Disease and malnutrition spread quickly, while medical facilities were overwhelmed by wounded fighters and civilians alike. Prisoners of war often faced horrific abuse, including torture and executions, as all sides committed war crimes that shocked the world. The psychological toll was devastating. Soldiers were forced into situations where they witnessed, or even carried out, atrocities against civilians. The massacre at Srebrenica in 1995, where more than 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were slaughtered, epitomized the scale of brutality. Unlike traditional wars, where the enemy was a distant army, the Yugoslav Wars often pitted men against former neighbors, or even relatives, magnifying the trauma and moral scars. By the time the wars ended, over 140,000 people were dead, and millions more displaced. Soldiers who survived carried not just physical wounds, but also lifelong psychological damage. For many, the Yugoslav Wars were not just about territory or politics. They were a descent into chaos, where the very fabric of society unraveled and the line between soldier and executioner blurred. Thank you for watching. If you learned anything, throw me a like and comment below on what you would like to see in the future. History never runs out of surprises, and neither do we. So subscribe and join me for the next dive into the archives.